All right, you are listening to or watching PH2T3R Pater, the Journal of Solar Culture. And tonight our show is on Warhammer 40K. And we are joined, as always, by my co-host, Mr. C.B. Robertson, author of many fine books, and by another member of the First Men, Montana, who lives in West Virginia, which always confuses me. He's two states. but Montana is one of the many guys in the Order of Fire's First Men who has an interest in Warhammer 40K, and I don't know anything about Warhammer 40K. Although I tried, one does not simply like dabble in the lore. From what I understand, I did a little YouTube watching on their recommendation this week just to get a sense of what I was talking about. But what was really cool is in the First Men, we had a handful of guys who were into this thing, and according to them, and I can kind of see why after looking into it a little bit, it seems to overlap with Solar Idealism, and it's a thing that a lot of men enjoy. I've encountered it before. There are a lot of men who are really into Warhammer 40K, and it's just kind of this thing that men do that other people don't know about. And also CB has done some of it in the past. So I figured we'd do a show about it, and fans of the Warhammer 40K can see that we have guys that are into that, and also we can discuss where the overlaps are in that universe and with Solar Idealism, and what makes it compelling and interesting. What's drawing all these guys to this thing? Because it seems like a fairly positive pursuit. We had somebody get spicy with us in our in the Greater Mandala Telegram chat and be like, "Why are you guys playing games anyway?" But someone else made a point about chess, which Chris plays, and I'm like, "What is the difference? Really? If you have something with a whole bunch of intellectual involvement and lore, and it's a hobby, but it's also keeping the mind involved and so forth. What would be the difference? So I think that was a good point to put towards it. So yeah. To start, I think maybe Montana, since people are used to hearing us talk all the time. Montana, why don't you tell me a little bit about Warhammer 40K? Let's get it started for people who, let's say, haven't heard anything about it.
Can I say one thing
what is it?
First, real quick, on the difference between chess and Warhammer 40K? As big of a fan as I am of chess, and as enjoyable as it is, Warhammer 40K does have the gaming aspect, which is why I got into it. But it also has this lore, and it has a tremendous artistic aspect to it. So if there is a comparison to be made with chess, there are degrees in which it is actually even arguably perhaps richer than chess off the bat. So cool. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Defining what it is honestly quite a challenge, because it is so many things. I think the best way to kind of condense it is that it is a multimedia world building project that started as a tabletop war game, but in the 90s and early 2000s started to expand out into video games, into literally hundreds of novels, multiple spin-offs of board games. It's now branching out into animated series and even into live action TV shows. So Henry Cavill of Superman recently acquired a project to be executive producer and star in a live action Warhammer 40K series. So the whole universe is really branched out in all different forms of media. But it's a science fiction universe that has just taken on a life of its own. It's really one of those things that's a monumental task to try to condense the lore into this podcast. Like, that would be more appropriate for a semester-long college course. But through the course of this conversation, then I hope that we'll at least uh, lay out a buffet of lore for guys that have never heard of it that might inspire them to kind of explore a new mythic universe.
Well, 40K, for those of you who are, because I didn't know what that is, like what is 40K was. It's the 41st century is when this whole thing takes place. Is that correct?
41st millennium. Yeah. In the year 40,000. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. So it's right.
And the lore, the TLDR lore for those who are like have no frame of reference for what we're talking about is that there is, humanity has advanced such that it has genetically enhanced Spartan super soldiers who are fighting off ancient robot zombies who are also at war with like alien xenomorph bugs who are also at war with like space elves and their dark compatriots, plus orcs that are obsessed with speed, and a few other groups that are all trying to kill each other for a variety of different reasons.
That's where we're at currently. I think we can maybe give a little bit of backdrop for how we got to that point. And I've really given this a lot of thought over the past week on how to get someone initiated into the lore. And I think one of the best places to start is talking about the warp. So in the 40K universe, the warp, also called the immaterium or the realm of chaos, is kind of this dimensional plane that exists outside of time and space as we know it, real space in their terminology. It's just a pure realm of psychic potentiation. It's very Lovecraftian. So it's like the realm where thoughts and emotions pour into, and based on like the energy frequencies of those thoughts or emotions, they start to kind of coalesce. And when given enough power, they can take on corporeal form. So these warp entities. So that's how you have the birth of these chaos gods in the Warhammer 40K universe. So there's 4 major chaos gods: Khorne, Slanesh, Nurgle, and Tzeentch. So when enough energy is poured into the warp, it can take on forms. And one of these forms actually is the Emperor of Mankind. So in a sense, he is a warp entity. I'm going to circle back to him later, of course. But I just got to set the stage for the warp. So around the 4th millennium, humanity learns of the warp and learns how to harness it and develops these warp drives that enable them to punch their starships into the warp and come out the other side. So in the 40K universe, that is actually how they do faster than light travel, is punching into this psychic realm. So like in Star Trek, I don't know what, I'm not a Trekkie, so I don't know what sort of light speed technology they have, but I know in Star Wars, they have like the hyperdrive. So in Warhammer 40K, they go through hell, basically. That's how they start to colonize the universe. So yeah, they set up these warp drives, punch through the warp, and come out the other side, and humanity starts to set up colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter, set up this like interplanetary civilization, and basically set up this pretty advanced utopia situation. And then there's the rise of this space elf Eldar civilization, and they are very psychically attuned and far more advanced in their mastery of the warp and the realm of chaos. And they really bend it to their will and set up this perfect society where all their wants and needs are met. It's like they're able to literally 3D print anything that their imagination can conjure. All of their wants and needs are met instantaneously. So they have nothing better to do but set up these pleasure worlds, like these worlds of just pure sadomasochistic hedonism. That's all they have left. And it creates this potent warp storm that makes it very difficult for humanity to traverse the realm of chaos, and the whole civilization just begins to collapse. And all of these trade networks are just totally dysfunctional, and humanity descends out of that golden age of technology into a technocratic dark age. just ruled by anarchy and techno barbarians. And then that is when the emperor, who has been coalescing in the warp, is birthed into real space. So throughout all of human history, all these great military leaders and diplomatic rulers and all these demigods, whenever they die, their energy is released back into the warp, snowballing, just waiting for the perfect moment to manifest into this avatar of the indomitable spirit of humanity. And he takes form in the 20th millennium-ish and leads humanity back to a golden age and to begin to colonize the galaxy as a whole. And yeah, that's my best pitch for how we get from where we are now in this sort of primitive stage of technology to the far advanced spacefaring civilization of the Warhammer 40K universe. I hope that wasn't just word vomit. Again, this is really
no. I mean, yeah. I listened to I think at about an hour and a half of the video that you recommended as an intro. And one thing that struck me about it that I thought was interesting about the world is that that the Emperor of Mankind insists on having a secular society in which he refuses to be a god, even though he's clearly a god. Like from everything that is described, in any way that you would describe a god, that is what he is. But he refuses to and puts people down basically for calling him a god.
Yes, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's a crucial element of the lore. So whenever the Emperor goes on, after they master the warp and bring humanity back into that golden age, they embark on a great crusade to reunite all of the disconnected planets and civilizations of humanity and try to bring them under the imperial banner. And he does it with such efficiency that they begin to revere him as a god. And he's like, no, I mean, if this is going to be a prosperous civilization, we have to abandon all these superstitions of old. And you see this play out in the real world too, like with Buddha. Like that was one of the things, like on his deathbed, like wanting to reject any claims of divinity. And then it's like, oh, you're so humble to reject your godhood. And that's kind of what we see
like the life
in
of Brian.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, like as they begin to colonize the galaxy, the Emperor encounters all of these religious traditions and all of these unique human cultures that have established. And instead of trying to command them into this homogenous culture, he tries to synthesize them into a syncretic, unified sort of ethos, while allowing those cultures to have their unique identity, but just trying to figure out a way to bring them all together harmoniously, which should probably sound familiar to both of you guys by now.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's a problem in what the warp does to some portion of humanity, is there not? Or am I getting ahead of the storyline a little bit?
I mean, the warp is not to be fucked with. Yeah.
I'm speaking of my chosen army from circa 2007 would have been. No, we're older than that. Like 2000. Yeah, like 6. Somewhere back there. I had Alpha Legion guys. Really.
One of my most recent collections is the Emperor's Children, the corrupted Emperor's Children. It's the ones Slanesh. That fell to the Chaos God Slanesh. And they fell hard. So
basically the warp and the Eldar, Dark Eldar, because my true first army was actually Dark Eldar before they got renamed into something else.
Drakari.
Yeah. And they're their own interesting case. They're really fast though on the table. But the Space Marines themselves, the humanity and their super soldiers, basically fell, and they fell into 9 different sort of legions. There's the 4 main gods, which are like Korn, the blood god, Nurgle, which is this illness, sickness, plague god of sorts. Then there's Slanesh, who is this like pleasure, sex god. And then there's Tzeentch, which is this very kind of strange Egyptian-themed psychic god, where there are guys like teleport and turn enemies into strange monsters and things. And then there's 4 like more or less secular legions. There was Alpha Legion, which they're like sneaky bastards that infiltrate. They're basically the Green Berets of the Chaos Army. They have their armies of cultists if you choose. And then there's the Iron Legion, which with all their tanks. And then there was the one with the bikes. And then there was the one with the jetpacks. Or am I misremembering those? I don't remember the names offhand. I should, but I don't.
Iron Warriors, Black Legion.
Black Legion was undivided. Black Legion is the sort of catch-all general one.
Yeah. I think we may need to back up for a minute and explain the Primarchs to Jack. I think he would really dig this.
Jumping ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
So, as the Emperor's Great Crusade kind of became self-sustaining, and he had generals kind of leading the charge there, the Emperor stepped away and created a laboratory under the Himalayas to begin a project to develop the Primarchs. So what he did was he extracted his own genome and synthesized it in a laboratory and created 20 genetic offshoots of himself and performed various mutations to highlight and accentuate certain traits in each of those 20 gene seeds, and developed these demigods that were made in his image, and they were essentially his sons. So if we liken the Emperor to Indra, the Primarchs are his Maruts. And the ruinous powers of chaos saw what a threat the Emperor and his Maruts would be, that upon the completion of the Primarch project, those Primarchs were scattered throughout the galaxy. And the Emperor would spend the next 10,000 years trying to find them. But in the meantime, he developed 1,000 genetically augmented super soldiers that would act as sons unto those Primarchs, and those would go on to become the Space Marines. So that is sort of the hierarchy of the Emperor, the Maruts, and his angels. I said Maruts, the Primarchs, and the Space Marines.
Cool.
And then that culminates in the 30th millennium, at the height of the Great Crusade. The Primarchs are reunited with this Emperor, and that is when you really start to have this big push into. That's when the Imperium of Man, as we know it, truly becomes a galactic powerhouse. And then there is this monumental event called the Horus Heresy that is really too grand to even try to attempt to explain the lore in this, because I think it expands. The Horus Heresy series is almost 100 novels told from different perspectives and at different points in time. So it's really hard to explain what it is, but the crux of it is that the ruinous powers of chaos begin to whisper to the Primarchs and infiltrate the Space Marine legions, and there is a civil war that ends up breaking out where half of those Primarchs are corrupted by the whispers of chaos and take the legions with them, and then you have brother on brother intergalactic civil war for 10,000 years that eventually ends with the chosen Primarch, the first among equals, Horus, taking up arms against the Emperor himself and essentially slaying him. So the Emperor is left mortally wounded, and placed upon a life support system called the Golden Throne, where he is essentially in a persistent vegetative state, and these class of priests are appointed to interpret the Emperor's will through tapping into the warp and trying to read his psychic emanations to determine the course of action, which then sets humanity on this downward spiral towards the most brutal totalitarian regime that the universe has ever known. So the 41st millennium, this Warhammer universe that we're talking about, it is not by any stretch of the imagination a place that you would want to live. It is very pro-human, but very anti-humanity. It is, you are condemned to labor at all hours of the day, and they will grind your bones into dust, quite literally, and feed your body as rations back to the labor force, just to keep this persistent war effort going, as humanity is beset on all sides by the forces of chaos and all of these hungry, savage Xenos races and heretics and mutants from the inside who want to dismantle the Imperium.
All right, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit, because obviously he said 100 novels. It's amazing. And that's something I want to come back to as well. But what do you think the appeal is of just generally to men? Why is this so popular? Because obviously, from what I understand, it came out in the like late 80s or early 90s. And then, we are now quite a bit past that. It apparently came out while I was in high school. And then we're that much older. It's been around for that long. And so, I mean, obviously it's become extremely popular. What do you think the appeal to men is? And this is a men's thing, and aside from a video that I think Chris sent me, which I didn't watch, but I'm sure it's horrible. But it's essentially like this men's hobby that has persisted over a very long period. I mean, what do you think the appeal is?
Well, the video I sent you that you didn't watch from Sargon about how the universe was essentially killed. I don't know if it's fully dead, but Games Workshop is the creator is kind of doing its best to kill it. It is trying to kill it over what it was for many men, which was a space of it was kind of an uncontrolled space. It was a space of freedom from the sort of cultural establishment, the nature of the universe in its foreignness from our world is also free from the sort of cultural ideologies that plague us in real life. So it's this space to follow things in sort of a masculine frame, and to explore these things and to stay in this world apart from the cultural impositions of our world.
So meaning like intersectionality and all that shit.
Yeah, exactly. And the neat thing about this is something Curtis Yarvin used to talk about with the early internet back in the 90s. Because it was a fairly small hobby, there were a number of barriers to entry. One, it has this very nerdish association and identity that keeps away the sort of cool kids that might try to, so to speak, like gentrify would be the sort of academic term, and to alter it from its nature. It only attracts the people who are into the thing for the thing, Henry Cavill's been kind of changing that a little bit recently, but because he's been a big player for quite some time, as I understand it. But and it's also just so many male hobbies mashed up into one: sci-fi, speculation, and world building, strategy games, art. Guys will sit down and spend hours painting, coming up with, I can do this modeling technique to get a unique texture. I'm going to dry brush silver over turquoise to get a kind of unique sheen coat. I'm going to, use this stencil to get lightning marks on my the one guy here, some of the most extraordinary art done by men today is in these miniature worlds.
Yeah, I think we actually had a guy join the order for just a minute. He was in only for like a month or something, I think. He was in England, and he was. I think he had a side hustle of just painting Warhammer figures and selling them. Yeah, and which was cool. I mean, I think he would have been surprised that this eventually became, a discussion within the order. But yeah, I mean, it's that which was amazing to me. I'm like, you what? I'm like, you have a side hustle painting figures that other people are supposed to paint, but you paint them for them so they have some other. I'm like, wow, that's a whole economy,
No, I mean it's such a niche hobby, and like Chris said, there's so many barriers to entry. Like cost aside, there's a lot of psychological friction to getting into the hobby. Like for instance, I have the rule book in front of me. This is a dense tome. This is a rule book to play a tabletop game. So like already you have to be okay with extremely dense literature. You have to be okay with playing a game based around arithmetic. You have to play a game that it may take you 50 hours of meticulously building and painting a model smaller than the size of your thumb 100 times over to field a full roster. The rich lore. I mean, there's just you're either all in, you either get exposed to it and you're like, that's not for me, or you are all in. And I just think it's so interesting that we have concentrated so many guys in the Order of Fire that are into it. And I'm like, there's something here. Like that, would you say a third of our guys are at least tangentially into it?
Maybe a third. At least, yeah. I would say maybe close to 25%. But like, yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell. But yeah, a good number.
So there's something there. I don't know exactly what. And I think we'll probably figure that out in the course of this conversation. I hope we do. But there's definitely something there.
I'm reminded a little bit of sorry to keep bringing this guy up, but Scott Adams got canceled. Got his Dilbert cartoon was removed from a number of newspapers like a year and a half ago or so because of some comments he made. He got canceled, and so he redid Dilbert. He calls it Dilbert Reborn now, and it's a little bit more edgy than it was before. And he said, as a creative person, being canceled was the best thing that ever happened to me, because so many things that my editors would not have allowed me to do, and I felt so creatively constrained, have now been opened up. And now all of there are all these untapped potentials for creative direction in different kinds of jokes and different sort of themes I can develop in these comics. And I feel like many men feel that way too. We've talked, of course, about art a number of times in the past, and men do have this creative impulse, this creative instinct, but we are so constrained by cultural mores of what we should be doing art about, or what's okay, what's not okay. Men like weapons. We like war stuff. We like stories about war stuff, and this is treated, if not as outright pathological, then at least as something unhealthy that should be discouraged, I think, especially among young boys. One mass shooting story in the news, and everyone's like, oh, let's keep away from gun type stuff for a couple weeks. Meanwhile, we're like painting our heavy bolters over here. Like there's, here's a creative world that is, like Montana was saying, that is niche and nerdy and was until recently relatively unpoliced. Again, because its framework, the whole basis and base assumptions of the universe, this we're so far in the future, there's this thing called the warp, there's all these different species, everything is different. The moral rules that govern our societies and what we think is okay and not okay don't apply here. So there's creative freedom where men can explore and express their own creative ideas, and whether that's in the story behind their particular army, it might be a 500-point army or a 2,500-point army, or the aesthetic, the way they build their guys, their posture. Are these zombie like Nurgle guys, or are these like slick and fast Dark Eldar, or just the design of the army itself has a creative elements to it. So there's all of these. It's like Montana was saying. It's this multimedia setting. It's a context and a framework within which men can express masculine creative ideas, relatively unpoliced.
And to give Jack and our listeners a little bit of context to what you've alluded to a couple times, so there's this faction within the Imperium called the Adeptus Custodes, and they are the Emperor Mankind's personal bodyguards. A lot of our guys in the Order are really into them because they have this glorious golden aesthetic and eagles all over them. Really badass. But they're exclusively male, just like all of the Space Marines. Until recently, there was one, I think it was just like a paragraph or like even a footnote in the Army manual for the Custodes that referenced a female custody. So there was this massive internet uproar for a few weeks.
You can't sneak one past the nerds. They pay attention to that shit.
Yeah, it was really overblown. Like I said, it was just like a footnote, quick mention from one author. So there was all this uproar, and they're like, okay, they finally compromised 40K. Like it's the sex pollution phenomenon. Like they finally got it. Like they've introduced female custodies, and a lot of people were quick to be like, it's over. Like they got it. But the really cool thing to see is that since this is an analog hobby, like it's almost like larger than the company who controls the IP. So like then there's like an equal number of guys being like, well, that doesn't exist in my head canon. It's not real.
We're going to reject that book from the canon.
Yeah, they're like
Nicene Council.
You can't rely on information in the Imperium anyway. Like it's so disconnected and bureaucratic. Like that was probably just a typo from the scribe who wrote that down in the universe, and he was probably liquefied and made into corpse starch. So like it just doesn't exist. So like it's just cool because like, and you see this in D&D too, like with these old heads from the 80s and 90s, like they call them grognards, but they're the guys who were resistant when these newer editions came out, and they're like, you're watering it down. They're like, it's not as crunchy and tactical as it used to be back in the day. We're not buying 5th edition. We're going to stick to our advanced D&D in our attic. So these traditions kind of uphold over time, and like they kind of become incorruptible in that way. And like, you even have like these headcanon sort of things that pop up in different Warhammer scenes throughout the community, because like you can play the tabletop game sort of with this narrative mindset, and there's even sections of the rule book that like give you guidelines on how you want to tell this collaborative ongoing story week to week based on what happens in a given game. And it kind of gives you some written mechanics for how to keep track of the fighting morale of certain units depending on what happened the last game, and certain win conditions that might be set up the next week. So local scenes kind of have their own meta narrative for what's going on in the Warhammer universe. And it like Chris was talking about, like it's such a powerful vehicle for the imagination, and it provides this like perfect little box of constraint for guys who might think that they're otherwise not creative to really express their innate talent for storytelling and imagination and world building and artistry even. Like I've never painted a canvas in my life, but I have painted some scale models that I'm really proud of. Like I spent probably 20 hours building and painting this, and I would probably say that's on the low side for what some expert level painters would pour into a scale model like this.
That's badass, dude. I was prepared to show off my one of my little Chaos Space Marines, which I was like absolutely like lame by comparison, but like, oh, he's a like an Alpha Legion soldier guy, but not like a freaking like dreadnought of that scale. That's freaking cool. No, when I would play back in middle school, we would actually use like risk pieces as proxies. So, because they were so expensive, like we could only afford so much. So if we wanted to have like 1,500 point battles, or we're always like play testing different army setup strategies. So like, oh, what if I rebalance it with more fast attack and less heavy support here? Oh, I just absolutely got crushed by my brother's orcs army. Darn it. Got to rebalance it back, and that like play testing and trying out different strategic designs was like that was more my focus when I was more involved in it. But the guys would build armies around the lore too in some cases, and of course some guys would do it based on what they thought would look the coolest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've actually I've not played a ton myself. I've played maybe 10 games. For me, like I think the game is fun. In my experience, it takes a really long time to play.
It does.
A full roster, especially if you're not familiar with the rules well enough to know them offhand, and you have to reference that book over and over. But for me, like what I enjoyed the most is just being immersed in, like, when you see how much passion somebody has put into that hand-built, hand-painted army and all the terrain too. Like it feels very vividly real to see it unfold on the tabletop. And it's almost a social faux pas to bring an unpainted army just to play the game, because it's almost like you're robbing your opponent of that immersive experience.
Jack and I have talked about this, about showing up to the opera in regular clothes.
Exactly.
That's what I thought of the exact same thing.
Yeah. No. When we would play, like, you know, play testing armies in our basement with risk pieces, we did that with each other. But then when we found a system we liked, we would go buy the pieces, and we'd paint it. We wouldn't spend, well, my one friend Peter would, but most of us would only spend like maybe 10 minutes per model, if that. But he would, the one friend would spend a lot of time on his Necrons, getting them like really, really nice looking. It was very, very impressive. And what you end up with in the composite, like, array of the army, like you were describing, it's almost overwhelming, because you're seeing like in one visual look, you're seeing thought behind the design of the army, whatever the motivation was, strategic, lore, visual, whatever. The money spent on that, like each bottle of paint is like $15. Like, this stuff is not cheap. And then the models are like probably $1 to $4 a piece.
It's hard to price, because sometimes those character models, depending if it's like a very powerful character, it might be $50 for that 128 millimeter model.
Yeah. It can get really pricey really quick. And so you'll be looking at, like, all told, between the glue, the paint, the plastic itself, little modification kits, maybe you add other stuff like little bits of gravel on the base to make it look, fit into terrain. You look at like $3,000-$4,000 for like a 2,000 point army, if not more, plus all the time and the thought, and it strikes you as this huge investment, and it's visually it fits together, it performs a function within the context of this world, and it's an extraordinary thing, kind of. I mean, if you are initiated into this world, then you know what you're looking at. That is.
Though it's interesting though, because like so many of our guys in the order, they are very deep into the lore, but have never played the tabletop game. And then you have the opposite too. Like, you have people that are all about the building and painting that have never played it. Maybe they don't even know much about the lore, but they just think the models look badass. Like, it just seems like there's something for everybody in this hobby, in this universe.
Yeah. But I mean, if you are like me, who is primarily into it for the strategy and the combat game side, like, and I was never like terribly into the lore, but like the lore is not aversive. The lore, even though that's not the primary thing I'm into, it still enhances the experience, and the visuals of the model certainly enhance the experience. Like there are definitely, my brother played Tyranids, and he definitely made a few unit choices purely on the basis of looks. Going for lictors over maybe some other choices. Lictors were these basically like 3 times taller than a human being praying mantises that blend in with things and will pop out from cover the other side didn't know about and just like eat someone whole. They're pretty cool.
But yeah, I think also too, like what draws so many men in, especially to the lore, is that we're very faction oriented creatures as humans. And there are so many factions and sub factions that it's so easy to find your identity through their stories. And depending on which niche of mythology or history that you're really into, there is probably a Space Marine Legion that is just steeped in that. So, like, for example, I think one of the most badass legions in the Imperium is the White Scars Legion. So they're ruled by the Primarch Jagtai Khan, and they are modeled after the Mongolians. So instead of riding around on horseback across the steppe, they are speeding across the battlefield on jet bikes, wielding chainsaw swords and doing cavalry charges. And
one of our early comments here, Death Before Disarm FPV, says White Scars are Mongols on motorbikes.
yeah, there it is. Or you have the Space Wolves, led by the Primarch Leman Russ, who regard the Emperor as the Allfather, and they are Norse Vikings in space. Or you might have the Ultramarines, who are modeled after the Roman legions, and it goes on and on. Like, pretty much, as one of our guys was saying in the chat this morning, like, you will find every human myth and period of history somewhere in this lore, and it gives this really positive vision of what the future might look like, and how we can synthesize a future primitive society in a way, kind of like what we're trying to do in using these aesthetics. And one thing that I learned this week that I didn't know before is the official symbol of the Imperium of Man is a double-headed eagle,
right,
with one head facing towards the past with its eyes shut, and one head facing towards the future with its eyes open. So the head looking towards the past, it's acknowledging it, but the eyes are only set on the future. And if that isn't solar idealism in a nutshell, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I caught that actually in the video. I was like, nice. Yeah, there's almost like a Janus kind of thing with the past and the future. But I like that a lot. And that those kind of overlaps, I think, are some of the reasons why some of our guys, the spirit of the thing seems to be similar. I mean, what fascinates me about this, as much as anything, is, like you said, the time and energy that goes into it. And it obviously represents a real desire for an elaborate mythology. It's like, well, we don't have an elaborate mythology, so we will create one. And somebody created one. They keep creating. I mean, this is a good question, I think, because you said there are like 100 books. I mean, how is this like a fan fiction thing where people are putting out all kinds of fan fiction, or is this like a set group of authors that are like under the control of one thing, or what? How does that work?
There is a subsect of Games Workshop called the Black Library that is just essentially what you described. It's a contingent of authors who are just continually writing within the universe, and they are essentially the canon makers of the lore. There is quite a substantial bit of fan fiction as well, and that kind of gets into an interesting conversation of like, what is canon? Like, what can we constitute as being the real myth, and what should be discarded.
Yeah, even the video you sent me, the guy who was explaining it, he's like, there are many theories about how the emperor came to be, and no one has really agreed on what the theory actually is. You know, like he's like, I don't buy the mainstream theory. You know, he went into his whole like like explanation of the thing, and so there's obviously a great deal of room for personal interpretation.
Yeah,
that's happening there as well.
I mean, it's so interesting that we could sit and discuss the lore of a fictional universe that was invented in 1987 as if it were science, historical fact. Like it is such a rich lore, and it's like in the grand scheme of things, like that is not a long time for a mythic tradition of this scale to be born and to be so real in the imaginations of so many men.
Well, I know, and I think that's that is why I think there's so much potential too in solar idealism. It's like, well, there's an infinite amount of possibility that could be built into that. Like how much would you like to expand it out? Because these things, I always tell the same story, but I'll tell it because we'll have different listeners right now. But when I was doing Germanic paganism, I always had I'd have these guys, especially veterans, but just a lot of guys would come up to me and be like, Tyr is my god. And I'm like, oh, the god with one story. Like he's only mentioned once. He has only in one story, but they have built out in their mind all this meaning from a few metaphors, like from a few like lines and metaphors. They built this like really complex and important meaning to them. And I'm not saying that to make fun of it. I'm saying that that's how our minds work. So like it's which is exciting. It's like in the way that. I mean, because you have this universe, right? But they're also like, there's whole worlds of fan fiction for like Star Trek and like whole worlds of, multiple novels and books and whatever, whole universes of lore that have been created in the modern era. Whereas when we look back and we see what the Greeks were doing, we obviously did that whole series on the Orseia and, writing the gods in as fictional characters was part of what was going on as the Greeks were creating their lore in real time. If you look at many of the old poems and stuff, there was one guy who decided to write down his version of the lore, rather than it wasn't canonical in the way that like Christians have like, and I almost wrote this into the thing I was reading the other day about, it's like these books, like as the book, create a static thing. Like if there's only the one book, it creates something that's static, and then you're stuck with it. And like maybe that's why it's stuck around for so long, because when you have these universes of like many people writing books and many people interpreting things, and like things evolve in a different, they can't be static because they keep moving. And whereas I think when you have this, like, this is the book, this is the one book you get, here you go, that's a static thing. And whereas I think the Greek traditions, and obviously if you look at like what the Vedic stuff, and then it moving into Hinduism and all that stuff, there's so many people writing different versions of different things that it just evolves on its own. And maybe that's the more organic way and more natural, more human way for these things to progress.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is kind of what Sargon or Carl Benjamin was talking about in his video about lore and canon. He was actually quoting Aristotle and saying that the purpose of these stories is it is entertainment. It's intrinsically enjoyable, but it also gives us a chance to think from premises and to flesh out what would happen. So it's actually a creative thinking exercise. And so if you have a story with one premise, it's not going to go, it can only really go one way,
right.
Presumably. If you have a story with 3 different premises, you're creating a whole lot of complexity there. How many premises are there in the Warhammer 40K universe? Well, there's a lot, you know. There's this whole history behind each of these different groups. There's different subcomponents of the groups, and there's, you know, the exponential number of possible you know, meetings or ways these things could go is innumerable, as are the number of things that could not happen. There are an infinite number of things that could not happen in this universe, and an infinite number of things that can happen in this universe, which creates this wonderful constrained and yet unconstrained playground to try things out, to stretch and flex those creative muscles, so to speak, in a variety of different ways and combinations.
Yeah, and it's like it said, it's the way that all these different lores, whether they're from comic books or these games or whatever. I mean, because obviously I'm like one generation back. Like I really wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons really bad. Like, you know, like at the right age, when I was the right age. By the time I was in high school, and I probably could have done it, I was already past. That was already out of it. But you know, I sat around drawing, like, you know, you draw your hero that you're gonna put in the thing and make your characters and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I see the appeal of it, and you know, drawing superheroes and all that kind of stuff. It's like you're making your own, creating this universe building, this god role that you're really doing, because that's what it is. That and fish tanks. Fish tanks are the same. Like, I am a god here. But you know, it's really exciting and creative thing to do, and I think if you look at the opportunities that you're giving these guys to create within the context of the universe is something that they really want to do, and a muscle that they really want to flex. And that's what I think the challenge is to do with the First Men, is to, like, how do I provide opportunities for people to express themselves and create without creating something evil, you know, like, so with it, creating things that are coherent with the whole philosophy, but give them to blossom in that way, and to create something really creative. We had a discussion yesterday, which kind of, it's good. Every once in a while, somebody can poke at me and make me like, why'd you say that? But you're right. You know, like, you know, usually I have a pretty good idea where I want to go with things, but Chris, who is one of the guys who's into Warhammer, really kind of pushed me on, like, we should have our own symbols. He just kind of said it offhandedly, but I was like, really should. You know, like that is the way. It's just one of those things, like when you're creating something like this, it's like, do you know what the man hours are on that? Like, you know, like there's so much to do. Like, but you're saying all these guys put all this time into it. And, you know, the idea of having glyphs that represent philosophical ideas, which is really what we're doing with when we take things from Sanskrit, like the Arita thing that we use, and what people did with runes, and the whole reason why people get so into runes is because they're just symbols for complex fields of meaning. You know, in the way that you guys probably, you know, like they're different segments of the game or whatever, like that you know, these different tribes that you're talking about have this whole thing of meaning behind them. But if you just show somebody this, they'll be like, oh, okay, well, that's that whole thing. And that's what symbols really are, is they have this whole narrative mimiplex that's behind them. And, you know, but you can compact that into this hieroglyph, you know, of that means something. And that becomes very meaningful for people, because then that one thing means all these things. And I mean, it's a tough thing to do. Like I joked when he said it, because I was like, oh, I'll just put on my whiteboard to make up a symbol that no one's come up with in the past 4,000 years of human history, and it's also not registered as a trademark. Yeah, I'll do that in my spare time tomorrow. But that's what you need. Like that kind of stuff. But then when you're talking about creating culture, which is the grand scale of our project, is to create culture, to create something new. Rather than these static things that we've been handed down, a new dynamic culture that people can, you know, like the Warhammer thing is confined as that it is entertainment in a game. But if we can take something that do the same thing, but not quite, like take it kind of out of the confines of being a game, I think that's an exciting project to do. But I don't know. It's like, I think it's just a challenging thing. Like, how do you create an environment where something like what is happening with Warhammer could happen with this?
Well, it's reminding me of Tolkien in a way, because he invented the Elvish language and that script and was a world builder of his own. And I think he's going to be one of those guys that a few hundred years from now will not necessarily be remembered as a novelist, but maybe as a canonizer of Northwestern European mythology. Like, I think that's really what his legacy will be in the grand scheme of the human story.
Well, I mean, how real, and as I said, this is what is fascinating about the barrier between myth that we, like these stories, the barrier between what we consider like, oh, that's a real myth that belonged to a culture, and this is a story that we all know and can talk about in great detail, and it has like a moral behind it and whatever. Like all of our guys in the order, are a lot of them are Tolkien fans, and I think had a whole discussion that I tried to stay out of about like who is the manliest between these two characters recently, and that was like paragraphs and paragraphs long of discussion. And that's, I mean, a fictional universe, but it means something because those characters are symbols of ideas to people. So like to be able to discuss that idea is really interesting. Like you said, with the whole Tolkien universe, that's all kinds of things. I mean, I can make a joke about being Gandalf and everybody knows what I'm saying. We're speaking the same language, and so that's really what myths are at the same day. If I say that no, I arrived when I plan to, you all know what I meant. That's an inside joke, and that's culture.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. But let's see. We've got a lot of comments.
Oh, do we?
Delightful. From a couple of guys. So we have our White Scars, our Mongols on motorcycles. Viking Bastiche says, "Make gatekeeping cool again." Yes. Thal has a lot to say, so I'm not gonna say every time this is Thal's comment. I'm just gonna read all of Thal's comments straight.
Okay.
Why people like it? Unreliable narrators in the stories. That is fun. It leaves more room for creativity. Chain swords and power armor is cool. Yes. Grim, dark, pulls no punches in lore, etc. Also, tell the guy the warp changes corrupts your mind, kind of like a mental illness. The more you accept chaos, the more it warps your reality. Bad things look cool, good things look bad, etc. Also, don't forget about Malice as the 5th chaos god. I'm not familiar with that. Not really canon anymore. I think they rolled him into Khorne. Anyway, Dark Library pretends he doesn't exist for some reason. Okay, this is a lore rabbit hole for the lore masters. Yep, the whole narrative point in separating the Space Marines into chapters of 1K, then stating there's too many for even the Imperium to keep track. There's too many for you. Okay. Was so fan. Oh, I don't know what he's referring to. He's saying something was so fans could paint and homebrew their own chapters with names and colors, etc. Same reason there are 18 Primarchs and not 20. Cough, cough. So fans could invent lore for the lost 2 Primarchs. Oh, that is actually a very clever storytelling technique, is to leave unhemmed threads for other people to finish up.
Yep. In the Imperial records, there's 2 Primarchs that are just redacted.
Tell the guest not to ask about the lost Primarchs. We don't talk about them. Looks around for the Inquisition. Nice. 40K was genius, leaving things ambiguous enough in everything to let the fans make it their own and add to the creation. Yes, just freaking genius move. Oh, well, he read my mind from like minutes ago. Yeah, isn't there tabletop players that do lore battles, like the entire army is made up of units and whatnot from a book? Oh, so they're doing like book recreations. Our speaking of tabletop gaming, this is not 40K, but our friend Greg Hamilton was involved in a tabletop gaming system based on World War II. And if the Warhammer 40K rulebook is like this, Greg Hamilton's rulebook was like that. It's just this absolute monstrosity of contingencies to try to replicate realism as close as possible. And he said, like, if you set up this battle that happened in Africa in 1983, at this time in this way, you'll end up with the same broken down tank in the exact same place as the real battle. Like, is like scarily accurate in being able to reproduce the real life results of actual battles. So, yeah. So, but going through and reproducing things like that is also a fun hobby because people like to reverse engineer how things happened.
And Greg, we brought up Greg in the chat as well, because I mean, and he would joke about the level of nerdery that went into that. I've seen his gaming table where he set all that shit up. It's like this whole basic room that he has in his house. And this dude's a Green Beret who's like, did special forces once, did all kinds of weird stuff. And I think he was a repo man. It's like all kinds of like, what was it? Who are the guys who go after warrants? I think he did something like that at some point. But he did all kinds of crazy shit, and then went back in like after 9/11. He went back in and like was older, and so then did like weird intel, creepy stuff, and tactical stuff, and then runs a whole gun training business. So it's like the nerd perception of like, yes, it's very nerdy, but also a dude who is not like the stereotypical nerd from The Simpsons kind of like guy.
No.
Because that's what people would love to pigeonhole. Like if you were going to talk to women on Twitter about what this is, their idea of what the guy would be who plays it is one thing. And then obviously the reality is a little bit different.
Well, they're not entirely wrong. Like I've said in the chat, like these super fit broy dudes that you see on Instagram doing the fitness Warhammer thing, like those are not the guys you're going to find in your friendly local game store.
Yeah,
you're going to find guys
the exception, not the rule.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Gotcha. The guys at the local shop, they're probably going to smell like taco seasoning and be wearing leather trench coats.
That's about right.
It is interesting because I almost took a picture for you guys the other day, but literally in the small strip mall where I train jiu-jitsu, there is a gaming store that says Warhammer 40K across the front of it, and Yu-Gi-Oh! And a couple other things, but like it's like literally 2 doors down from where I train jiu-jitsu, and it'd be interesting if there's any crossover whatsoever.
So get this, my gym is getting a new location at the end of this month. On the other side of the wall is the Warhammer store. I will never financially recover from this.
Oh man.
Awesome.
Terrible. It'd be like if they put a bookstore next to the local gun shop. Let's see. Nice. Death Before Disarm FPV says, just as there are World War II tabletop reenactment games, so that we keep getting preempted by the chat, talking about World War II tabletop reenactment games. Fall says, cools, I figured I'm a lore guy, not a tabletop guy, so I've heard stories and such. Don't forget to tell them about the orcs. They're hilarious little, if they believe it will work tech wise. Yes, so orc technology is like the it's almost like the comic relief of the 40K universe. All of their machines work on the placebo principle, basically. They put it together, and there's no reason these nonsense machines should work, but because they think they did it, it actually works. They're actually like like psychic savants, but they're also kind of idiots. So they're fun.
They were the orcs were originally meant as a parody of the Cockney working class. So they all talk in these ridiculous Cockney accents. And they're also meant to satirize the soccer hooligans too. Like orcs just want to fuck shit up for fun. Like they are so happy to be alive and fighting. Like the orcs want to wage war against everybody, but they don't hate humanity by any means. They love humanity because humies put up a good fight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're like Joker. Kill you? I don't want to kill you. What would I do without you? Yeah, my brother played Tyranids and Orcs. I was Dark Eldar and Chaos Space Marines. Thal says, model people are total nerds. The cool ones are all into the lore. No bias.
Yeah.
Death Before Disarm FPV says Tyranids equal space alien dragons. True. Mm-hmm. Thal says based Alpha Legion or Salamanders. I like the best.
Yeah, we've been talking about this a lot in the Warhammer chat. Like we were talking like if the Order of Fire were a Space Marine Legion, what legion would we be? And I think the consensus was we would be a successor chapter of the Salamanders, which is a pretty cool spot to be. Like they're Primarch Vulcan, master of weapons and forging, resistant to fire, and they live on this volcanic world. And one of the rites of passage to become a salamander in that initiation process before you take on the genetic enhancements is to go out and slay a dragon, and then adorn your armor in its scales and in its skull. And they're one of the few Space Marine legions that truly care about humanity and civilians, because for the most part, like the Space Marines are demigods among mortals and find them very difficult to relate to because they've had their brains genetically augmented and their emotional processing units in their brain are just suppressed, and they're all about warfare. But the Salamanders are one of the few legions that will actually sacrifice themselves to save innocent civilians. So they're a very noble legion.
Nice.
I don't recall much. I can only think about the aesthetic and the color scheme and the vibe of the army. But weren't the what was the Jetpack Legion? Was that wasn't the Blood Angels? Was it?
They use a lot of jetpacks. Maybe Raven Guard.
I think was the Raven Guard the dark green ones with the bikes?
Dark Angels.
Oh, that's right. You're right. Yeah. And they're an interesting, ambiguous one, loyalty-wise, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think there are some that they consider fallen, but they are not necessarily corrupted by chaos. I think in the Imperial records, they are just marked as fallen, and their loyalty is very ambiguous. Nobody really knows what they're up to.
I also remember seeing a little bit of lore saying the loyalty of the Chaos Alpha Legion was also somewhat ambiguous. Like they had like 2 Primarchs or something, and like one of them was
and Omega something
like
Alpha and Omega something.
And it wasn't clear. It wasn't entirely clear if they were even on the same side, and if one of them was secretly loyal to the Emperor still and was doing some kind of double spy thing with his legion. But I never got deep enough into it to really explore that fully. But there's all kinds of fun stuff there. Death Before Disarm FPV says, I'm a Space Wolves and Raptors kind of dude myself. Good taste. Thal says, that's cool. I like the homeless too, lol. I'm teasing. Space Wolves are Space Vikings, and you can't get much cooler than that. The Emperor of Mankind works the same way, depending on where you are or who you talk to in the galaxy. The Emperor is depicted differently and worshipped differently. There are millions, but he is always worshipped as the Emperor. The Ecclesiarch sees to that. I feel like I've heard that word before. Ecclesiarch.
The Ecclesiarchy, that is the religious cult that ends up forming in the middle of the Horus Heresy that begins to revere the Emperor of Mankind as a god. And while he's a living, he rebukes that. So actually, the first Space Marine Legion that turns to chaos is the Word Bearers, and their Primarch Lorgar. One of his unique traits was he has this innate religiosity about him, and as the Great Crusade is unfolding, the Emperor observes that Lorgar's legions are very slow to move from planet to planet and perform their missions. So he goes to investigate, and what he finds is that the Word Bearers have begun to set up temples and churches devoted to the Emperor. And the Emperor rebukes it, demolishes the temples, and publicly shames him in front of the Imperium and puts him on trial. And with that being rebuked, his religiosity has to go somewhere. So he begins to investigate if there might be any other worthy forces in the universe worthy of placing worship upon. And that is where the ruinous powers of chaos conspire to turn him to the first traitor. And he is essentially the one who begins to whisper to Horus, who's appointed the War Master by the Emperor, the chosen Primarch, the first among equals, who's supposed to be the leader of the Great Crusade in the Emperor's absence. The Word Bearers Legion are the ones that kind of influence him to start taking Space Marines down this heretical path.
Yeah. I had one friend who had a Tau army and a Word Bearers army, and the Word Bearer, the way their army works is they just drop demon swarms on you, basically. And it was always kind of a hit or miss thing. Like sometimes it would work really well and sometimes it would just fail miserably. Death Before Disarm FPV, I only said it out of love. It's the back and forth banter about other stuff. Paul says, remember Shakespeare, everything is plagiarism, or if you prefer Romans, nothing new under the sun. Tolkien would so very cool with being remembered for that. The whole point of the Lord of the Rings was to preserve European mythologies. Yes. Viking Bastiche says Tom Bombadil, obviously. Brennan Cooney says the novel Dead Men Walking did sincere emotional damage, and that's a compliment. Grimdark is such a good medium for telling sincere tragedy. Death Corpse of Krieg, FTW. I don't know what any of that means. I'm assuming this is within the novels of the Warhammer 40K universe canon. But yeah, like again, it's that medium for men to express these creative ideas and to play out these premises and how would this work out.
We have a bunch of guys who are like many novels deep, like deep into that.
Viking Bastiche says neck beards with waifu pillows at Games Workshop. Yes, they are. Thal says at Brennan Cooney, The Siege of Vrax, Shivers. I'm assuming that's another novel. Brennan Cooney says deadlifts for the Emperor in all caps, which is arguably better than whiskey and deadlifts. Thal says, yep, salamanders will save you. Iron fists will ignore you. Black Templars will use you as a shield bull. Thal says, oh, I'm a 40K lore channel, just FYI. So anyone who's interested, maybe you can check out Thal's channel. I don't know how to open that in another page. Just open a little itty-bitty tiny icon of his profile image. And Brendan Cooney says, yes, Death Corps is an Imperial Guard regiment.
Yeah, the Death Corps of Krieg, they are modeled after World War I German forces. So they fight in gas masks, and they have like the piked helmets and the gray trench coats and all that. That's very much their aesthetic. And I think what's so cool about them is they have that future primitive thing going too. So they're like doing cavalry charges with las rifles with bayonets on these cybernetic war horses.
Yeah.
And fighting gas masks and trench coats. Like, it's a really cool aesthetic they have going on.
I think aesthetically, my favorite army is actually not even in the Space Marine or Chaos faction. There's a way you can set up your Eldar army to swap elites for troops. and you can have rangers as troop selections. So you can just have an entire army of snipers, and their snipers have these cool like hooded capes that people would paint on. I saw one guy set up his there are Imperial Guard snipers too, with capes. But one guy gave all of his Imperial Guard snipers ghillie suits, using like fancy terrain materials. Just really cool stuff you can do with that. But the Eldar Ranger armies, I forget what they're called, but they're super cool. Tactically, they're kind of a one-trick pony. They're really fun, like one time, and then they get either really boring and they just crush everyone, or they have something you can't counter and you just get annihilated. But aesthetically, really neat. Brennan says, but the proto-futurism makes sense because you don't want to just nuke every city. Sometimes you have to do it the long, ugly way. Yes. Yeah. Well, Jack, do you have any further questions? Or are you pretty well knowledgeable about the 40K universe now?
Oh yeah, I understand it completely. No, I have all the knowledge now. No, the show that we like listen to. I mean, I feel like I got a lot. Like I had a vague sense of what the Horus Heresy and all that was about, and so that was it was really helpful. And yeah, no, I mean, like I said, I think it's very inspiring as to the level of detail that it's gone to, and the way it's expanded, and the way that there's so much thought and time and effort put into it. Because it just it shows how much potential is there. Like I joked the other day, I forget who I shared it with, but someone had made I think from the game Halo, someone had fabricated an actual like Halo helmet with the light inside, and was showing like all the steps that he'd gone through on the like on an Instagram reel or something like that, and it was fantastic. It was perfect, and I was like, if only we could harness that power. Like I want someone making like cool stuff that's like that, because men have a lot of talents. It's like you have to give them a reason to do something like that. And how can I problem solve this then becomes the game. I'm like, well, how can I get this done and make this thing? I mean, whether you have people, you think about all the things that men do in the world, and just people generally, not even just men, but like when it comes to whether you're talking about, I don't know, floats in like a parade, or like like all these different projects that men do that spend time. We have two members, and this is totally would shock many of our followers and so forth, but we have two members who just got back from Burning Man. And that's a whole nother thing where people spend like tons of money and months and months and months coming up with costumes and mechanical things and all kinds of stuff. I saw an overview of what that looks like now, because I've been aware of it for probably 20 years. And I saw an overview of what it looks like. I'm like, that looks like some kind of techno thing that's happening in the desert. It doesn't look like what I imagined it, being like 20 years ago. Being more kind of, I almost saw it as being more steampunk or something. But now it is clearly very high tech. Is what's going on out there.
And speaking of projects like that, you mentioned Halo earlier. Mm-hmm. There's a certain YouTuber who's fairly famous in the gun side of YouTube, who recently bought a Tesla Cybertruck, and he decided he was going to turn it into a Halo Warthog with the 50 cal on back and everything. He like repainted it. He redid the exterior. He did the mount. He made it visually pretty close, because the Tesla truck gives a pretty nice like starting point, and he built it out into a Warthog. And it's like a reminder that so much of the technology and the organizations and the things that people pursue in the real world really do begin in the inspiration provided by fiction, whether that's the cell phones that we have from Star Trek or whatever, or people just having a video game they like, I'm going to build that gun, or I'm going to build that truck. I'm going to build this exact get up from this thing, or we're going to launch a fashion line that was inspired by this vibe. And there's all kinds of great games and books and other various media that have their own kind of aesthetic that sticks out in an interesting way. One of them that I'm convinced is real. There was a trend going around in COVID, basically, of people modernizing lever action rifles. So, they had the lever action guns, and they'd put like pick rails on them with red dots and all kinds of just goofy stuff. And like the FUDs of the world are like, what are you doing? This is a monstrosity. And other guys are like, yeah, this is fun. Completely impractical, but it's kind of a look, and apparently they were super fun. And I am convinced that half of that was inspired by a video game called Borderlands. It's kind of a obscure but also fairly popular video game with a very weird illustration style and all kinds of this kind of future primitive technology built in. It was just a neat vibe that seems to have inspired things that people actually created in the real world. And Warhammer 40K seems to have all that potential for the same kinds of reasons that these other created universes have.
Yeah. I mean, as a personal anecdote, I got into role-playing games at a really young age, playing like RuneScape, World of Warcraft, Elder Scrolls, all that stuff. And I was always super into the whole dwarven archetype. Like, I just thought dwarves were so badass, and I just wanted to live underground and forge weapons for the gods. So, like, whenever I was in my 20s and I had disposable income, I started my own home forge and learned to work with steel. And it was, I don't think I ever would have done that had I not been inspired by all these fantastical universes in my childhood. So I do think like these fantasy traditions are a really cool way to sow interest in so many other practical things and kind of plant the seed for exploring mythology, like actual mythic traditions later in life too. And that reminds me of like one of the conversations that we were having in the Greater Mandala chat. I believe it was yesterday. Because we had one contrarian voice as we were discussing like the upcoming Warhammer 40K show. We had one guy who was like, I just want to say, like, I object to the thing. I think it's a distraction from more meaningful, productive work. I think there's a lot better things that we could be doing, a lot better things that we could be studying about than a fantasy universe. And like, I wasn't offended by the comment at all. Like in a lot of ways, it's very true. But in like anything, like it's about how you manage your time and how you approach it. And it led to a very productive conversation. But I wanted to ask you, Chris, because you're a tradesman, what do you think about the hobby aspect? Do you think that there is any translational value to working with modeling glue and paint with little plastic sculptures?
I feel like there's a danger here of going on a really deep tangent about economics. But whenever the subject of like capitalism comes up, which I'm convinced is not real, the inherent subjective nature of value rears its head again. And the reason that I argue that capitalism isn't real is because if capitalism was real, it would have a particular essence to it. But when you deregulate markets, what you actually end up with is freedom for value to follow where people place their value, right? And so you could have a capitalist society in an Islamic country where certain texts and certain kinds of geometric art and other things become valuable. Well, those are going to be the prized items, and those are going to dictate the tone and the quality and the essence of that society. And likewise in America, or certain parts of America, you might have more value placed on, a jacked F-350 than in certain parts of the Middle East where they might prefer a Ferrari. You know, there are different style. Yeah, or a Toyota, depending on which Islamic country. Toyotas are very well prized over here as well. But like the what people are willing to pay money for is what drives what's productive, right? Because productivity is essentially a euphemism for like, did you get paid, right? Well, what determines what people are willing to pay money for? You know, in what sense is it productive to build a cathedral? In what sense is it productive to create a 14-foot tall statue? In what sense is it productive to write a 24-book epic poem that is famous for 2,800 years? In what sense are any of these creative projects productive? It can only be in a subjective one, you know. And if we are not just eating to reproduce, to paraphrase Monty Python, The Meaning of Life, but if we are reproducing and surviving in order to experience something other than just survival itself in this life, then the subjective value of these things we put our blood, sweat, and tears into that are not productive could even be thought of as the most important things. I will say, like, some of my inspiration, I have like an amalgamation of inspirations that brought me into the electrical work. Some of it was philosophical, based on the work of Matthew Crawford and Robert Pirsig, but some of it was also artistic, not from games, but from certain movies. And it wasn't one movie in particular. There's an archetypal character who I'll call the black market technologist. And you see this in certain Mexicans in the film Elysium, who build what's his name's exoskeleton. They're these like chain smoking, like underground tatted up dudes but they make things work. They put things together. And I always thought, wouldn't that be a useful person to have around, or to be someone who's able to make things work when you don't have a lot of external supply to go around? And that was a big aesthetic inspiration for wanting to get into working with my hands more. Does that make as much money as I could have made if I went into finance or something? Probably not. But like, it's not all about that. You know, suppose I had gone into, pick the highest paying job, law, finance, whatever. What would I then spend my money on? A really, really big house. Why do I want a really big house? There's some inspiration behind that. Is that inspiration productive? It all comes back down to the subjective value. And this world creation in poetry, in games, in storytelling is where we find the things that we care about. And we test them out before our eyes and before our ears and see what resonates with us. And we tweak it, we modify it. Other people pick what we put down and carry it a little bit further. And we literally create value that creates the possibility for productivity in the marketplace. So what do I think about the economic potential of paint and glue? Well, I mean, it's there.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a discussion that often happens, especially sometimes it happens with guys who are just getting into like entry level manliness. Like we have to be focused on this, and other times it's guys who've only ever been focused on practical things, like all the practical things that you need to do to just survive. There are guys who are just framed that way, that's their number one concern, and I think a lot of men approach masculinity in a sense that's where their head needs to be. Like, how is this helping you feed your family, secure your home, pay the bills, all the serious business. Yeah. And that's like, I mean, I've had people up in the comments like berate me because like like when I was doing bodybuilding or whatever, like I was taking these glamour shots helping men and the cause, like shit like that. There's this thing that you always have where men are like serious things, but honestly, that's how we lost the arts.
Ironically,
only focus on the serious things. Like make money, shut up and make money.
It's an ironic thing too, because why does that message appeal to men?
Well, it's tactical virtues, basic shit.
They want to be that kind of men. There's an aesthetic appeal, and not to blow smoke, but I think this was a good point from I don't remember if it was becoming a barbarian or a more complete beast, but the idea that you can actually get by really well without focusing on the important stuff. You can completely neglect personal security. You can completely neglect physical competence in the classical manly skills and probably be fine. And by the way,
right now in our environment, yes,
focusing on these manly skills is not some guarantee of safety either. So it's neither necessary nor sufficient for survival. It might help a little bit, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient. The justification for pursuing masculinity is aesthetic. It is a better way to be based on the stories that inspired us. We are so built that when we read about, Leonidas and the Spartans taking on the fucking world at Thermopylae, it makes us want to go out and get a freaking hoplite spear, and train for the phalanx. It's incredibly inspiring, and it is entirely possible that Thermopylae never happened, the way that it is told.
Right.
Could be true. It's probably true, but it could be totally fiction, and it would not matter at all for most men who are inspired by that. The historicity and factuality of it is irrelevant to the inspirational power of the story. And like, if you want to be a man who is focused on the important things and doing all that, that is also coming from a certain aesthetic way of being that you've been inspired to emulate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because they get that idea of being Spartan in their head. Like, I should be able to do stuff without anything. I shouldn't have an attachment to anything. I should be able to sleep on a rock. And you're like, otherwise I'm a pussy. I'm ruined. I'm
laconic
soft.
response to every long paragraph. Yeah,
and that's a character that they want to inhabit.
Exactly.
And it's not to say that that's wrong or right or whatever, but that is a character that has inspired them. Is this is what a man is. This is like the pinnacle of what a man is, and that therefore I'm going to be that.
And if
so
you think about
aesthetic,
it, and if you think about it as a character you would like to inhabit and emulate, it frees you from often external feelings of obligation that are imposed upon you, perhaps, by people who don't necessarily have your best interest at heart, who want something out of you too. You might feel, if you were raised a certain way, an obligation to keep your head down and work 9 to 5 because that's honest work. And everyone who's aspiring more to that is a grifter or is a bad person or a sociopath or something else. And you can find yourself with these narratives that have been put in your head that will dismiss every other possible image as bad for some reason or other. And it's like, is this vision of the idealized, quiet 9 to 5 worker something you chose because it was inspiring to you? Or is that a story you inherited uncritically? And I think thinking about these things in terms of their story origin puts men in a greater artistic position of control and power to judge what kind of life do I want to have, which I think is important.
Right. Cool. So do we have any other comments? Because we should probably start wrapping up soon.
Yes. Thal says, If theirs is a Krieg guy standing toe to toe with a Space Marine, he will straight up fight him. No running, no crying, no nothing. And he will lose, but it's glorious. Thal says, best saying to explain 40K. Star Wars is real. Yeah. Star Trek is real. Yeah. 40K is real. F no. I'm not sure I'm tracking the grammar of the statement, but yeah, it would be good if Star Wars tech was real. It would be good if Star Trek was real. You would not want to be, as Montana was saying earlier, in a 40K universe.
Gotcha.
Not a fun time. Death Before Disarm FPV says people do that because those things are symbols and artifacts pulled directly from that awesome lore. Brandon Cooney says fictions like these either suck us deeper into ourselves or push us to do awesome stuff. Right. Death Before Disarm says, for instance, I'd love to have a wall of weapons from epic movies. Conan's swords next to Judge Dredd's Lawgiver pistol, just above Johnny Rico's rifle from Starship Troopers. Yeah, it's fun. It's inspiring. Brandon Cooney says, subscribed, always down for more 40K material. One of the most dedicated communities out there. That's Brendan subscribing to Thal. Cool. People are connecting. Nick says, what's up, fellas? I don't play video games, but I do support my friends, so I'm here. Nice. Yeah. Death Before Disarm says, Chris, why do you pick Chaos Space Marines? Well, I picked Alpha Legion because I liked the infiltration tactics strategically. There was you have the ability. The way I had my army set up was I had 2 lieutenants that were set up in such a way that they could basically leap out of an early infiltration position and engage 2 enemy squads on right from the get-go. Like on turn 1, like they could just leap in and tie up other units. Much more, and they were basically built to be they didn't do a lot of damage, but they were really, really, really tough. So I'd have 2 guys that could jump out, were really hard to kill, and could tie up other units while I had a bunch of infiltrated heavy guns in covered positions that could basically kill everything else. So I could tie up a lot of their army with some cheap, tough units. It was just a strategic way to divide and conquer the enemy from infiltrated positions. That's why.
I play a Chaos Army as well. I play Emperor's Children because I think the story of their fall to Chaos is so compelling. Like, I love who they are as loyalists to the Emperor. So, quick synopsis: like, the Emperor's Children are this legion of, like, their whole thing is they want to fight war as an expression of art. So, like, they, in their downtime when they're not crusading, they're sculpting marble, they're writing poetry and songs, they're posing for portraits, and they're often misunderstood. They're like, this isn't what we're bred to do. Like, why are you doing all of these things? And they're like, well, after the crusade is won, this is how our great deeds will be remembered. And their whole thing is like the ever long pursuit of perfection, and the chaos god Slanesh exploits that, because that's kind of his whole thing. Like, he's often reduced down to being like this god of lust, but it's really obsession, like the hedonic treadmill, the pursuit of like that the pursuit of perfection to the point of it being malignant, really. So he like exploits that in the Emperor's Children, and the Primarch Fulgrim eventually finds this Xenos weapon that has the spirit of Slanesh inside, and he takes it, and it basically begins to whisper to him. And like when he goes to his mirror, it basically gives him his body dysmorphia. Like, it's that sword basically does that negative affirmation track that one of our guys did for his creative challenge. Whispers everything that's wrong with him in his ears, and it's like, you are so imperfect. Like, look at you, you're a disgrace. So like, Fulgrim just tries so hard to perfect himself, and he starts showing up to like the briefing meetings, and he's like wearing this gaudy face paint, like doused in perfume and scented oils. And they're like, what the fuck's up with him? And then he starts having his apothecary, which is like the medical officer of the Space Marines, start tampering with the genetic code of the Emperor's children to make them more perfect, and basically trying to make them even greater warriors by like merging them with serpents so they could have the speed and agility, and fusing their flesh with their power armor so they could become even more sensitive and quick on the battlefield. And eventually they become corrupt beyond all recognition, and they're now kind of these like mutated sadomasochistic space marines of chaos. That, like Hellraiser, like the Cenobites would be very at home amongst the Emperor's children and Slanesh.
And they also have sound weapons, which is kind of
yeah, it's awesome. I have a model over here that's just sitting with primer that I need to finish up, but it's literally like this person with their vocal cords stretched out of their rib cage back onto this like sonic blaster, and like this amplifier stuffed into their mouth so that the screams can be amplified to the point that it would like liquefy the opponent from just the vibrational intensity. Yeah, they're fucked up. They're awesome.
So Montana, you've got a lot more experience in this. I've had a couple armies. You've got like plenty of armies, but Jack hasn't. Which aesthetically speaking, which army do you think Jack would end up with?
Aesthetically?
Yeah. I was thinking either Sinch or Grey Knights.
I have a Grey Knights collection. I could see Grey Knights. I think Adeptus Custodes also. I think he'd be right at home there.
Yeah, the all male version.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, unless anybody has anything else, do we need anything else from the comments? I see him scrolling. This is definitely one of the most exciting chats.
Someone else asked the same question. At Chris and Montana, what legion would be good for chat? Ha! I beat you that time.
That's funny. Very cool. Very
cool.
cool.
I think as one final footnote to this episode, we should talk about the game that is coming out, Space Marine 2, coming out for PC and console. Only reason I want to bring that up is because we have some guys in the order that are going to be playing together. And since it's cross-platform and all the consoles and PC people can play together, I think this would be a really potentially good networking opportunity for some guys to get to know each other. We were talking in the chat a while back that men often struggle to bond face-to-face. We often need to be shoulder to shoulder doing some sort of task. And, where we have this network of friends all across the world, like it's kind of challenging to do shoulder to shoulder stuff. And I think ideally we meet in the real world, and we try to do that as often as possible. But in the interim in between, like it might be kind of cool to get to know each other over some lobbies of Space Marine 2 while we slay hordes of Tyranids. So if that sounds of interest to anybody, make sure that you hit that drop down box down below and sign up for the Order of Fire's Greater Mandala chat, so that way we can get you in the Discord server and fire that up when it comes out on Tuesday. For
sure. I love where your head's at. That's great. I mean, that would be great. I mean, it'd be really cool. Anyone who knows me in terms of where I'm at with the First Man, the Order of Fire, and the Greater Mandala and all that stuff, is that I get really excited when the guys get together and are doing things. Especially when I find out that they've been doing things I don't even know about. That's like, I'm like, oh wow, these guys are friends and they're hanging out. That's like kind of the whole purpose. Is to create this network and to build it out. These guys who have the same basic values and way of looking at the world. If they can connect and kind of form a network, then that's how things happen and that's how things grow. So I'm always excited to see that and hear, even if it's stuff that I'm not doing. I don't have to do all the things. I'd love to see guys get together and do things that they're interested in. That'd be great to see guys get into the Greater Mandala chat, go and do this game with you guys. That'd be fantastic. Since we went down that road, which I should go at the end of the show anyway, the First Men, obviously we're still taking applications. and we will be for a while. I'm just going to keep that going because I want to keep adding new members to the Order of Fire. In the First Men, we have a lot of, have had a lot of new ones recently that are cool. And if we could just keep that growing, that'd be great. And we do have 2 events coming up. We have an event in South Carolina at the beginning of October. I believe I'll be seeing Montana there, and I'm excited about that. A bunch of guys from the East Coast I haven't seen in a while, and so that'll be a pretty big event, I think, for us. Not like crazy big, not Burning Man big, but it'll be a good number of us out there to do a ritual and to do some farm stuff and hopefully do some grappling as well. So I'm looking forward to all that. And if you're in the South there and you've thought about joining the First Men, now would be a good time because you can come out and hang out with us. Because that's, it's like Montana was saying, obviously we want to hang out as much as possible, but we are spread around the world. And so it's hard to do it, but we try to do it as much as possible. Because that's where this all becomes real in real life. It's cool to hang out on the internet, and we all do that. But whenever you can manifest that in what the nerds used to call meat space, that's cool. That's when it becomes real. Now you're like, oh, I have real life friends now, and that's we have a real culture that we're actually doing things, and and that's why people often ask, why do you do ritual and stuff like that? Well, it's to bring the ideas into real space and do real actions rather than I believe a thing on the internet. If you can actually bring something into reality, you're creating something in the world. Something happened, and so it's if you're thinking about joining, apply, and I'm adding people slowly as we get the applications. Also, I actually just after many struggles with American Airlines and various issues, I did book my trip this morning at 5 a.m. to, I will also be going to Tasmania in December to do a ritual and hang out with the guys in Australia out there. So that's coming up as well. So if you happen to be in Tasmania, we will be out there, or Australia, and you can make it out, or New Zealand or whatever, and you want to come and join us. That's a possibility if you're part of the First Men. So anyway, guys, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Montana, for joining us. It's always cool to introduce people to some of the other members of the First Man. We have so many cool guys, and I'm glad that Montana could come out and join us tonight and have the discussion about Warhammer. And I'm thinking the next show might be about Gilgamesh. I'm kind of on that page right now. So, yeah, and as always, we're interested in hearing ideas that you would like us to do shows about as well. So that's what the Greater Mandala Chat is for, and also obviously comments. And as always, leave us a comment, subscribe, all that stuff. So anyway, until next time, stay solar.
Stay solar.
For the Emperor.